Hi everyone. Today we are in my rhetorical theory class, and we are going to be talking about chapter 6 out of the textbook. For those who aren't in my class, I don't have the textbook. This is about analyzing forms of arguments, how arguments become, how patterns form within arguments, and how we start to sort of mimic the arguments of those who sort of argued before us or sort of created a text before us. So hopefully this will become clear throughout the video. I'm actually going to run through 2 days of material. There are a few additional YouTube clips that I would normally use as examples that you are welcome to click on. I'll put them down in the description of the YouTube comments. So check it out. I hope this starts to help you make some connections. This is one of my favorite ideas within rhetorical theory and just sort of literary theory in general. And so I hope you enjoy, and yeah, hopefully you start to see a lot of patterns emerge, not just the examples I give, but then with some of the things that you take interest in as far as, consuming media, whether it's books, movies, etc. So when it comes to analyzing form, the first thing that we need to know is that structure is important. The order matters. So in the textbook on page 113, they talk a little bit about the ideas of the American flag. So around me here on the screen, you can see sort of different variations of what we would consider the forms and colors and shapes used in the American flag, but we recognize that they're not an American flag, and so the way in which we would, come upon this, like, lifeguard tower, or this interesting design to, I guess it's to the left of me on your screen. We recognize that it's not sort of perfectly the American flag, right? And the same is true with arguments. When it comes to creating an argument, you need to make sure that your order is on point and that it helps the audience follow your argument logically and sort of takes them on the journey through your argument. If your argument's out of order, you still might make the same points, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to the audience as well because they're kind of bouncing around and creating the picture themselves. You want to create the picture for them. So in this design of the American flag here on the screen, this design of the American flag, it would be a lot easier to understand the ideals of the American flag if it was put together in order for you. But because you see it and it takes you a little bit extra time to sort of put it in order, you're not necessarily thinking clearly about the ideals of America. All right. The same thing is true with your arguments. So there's a couple different ways in which you create an argument. The first is what's known as a spatial order. So you can take the audience on a journey. So if you're in my public speaking class, for instance, and you want to sort of take the audience on a journey, let's say on a railroad ride, a train ride across the United States. You might, start in New York and then move down to Philadelphia, and then you kind of going across to Ohio, you end up in Chicago, right? And you eventually make your way to Los Angeles. This makes sense because it's sort of taking your audience on a journey. Same thing if you want to sort of track an audience with regard to, hiking through Europe or something. If you start bouncing around the map geographically, the audience just gets a little bit lost because they have to sort of create the geographical space for themselves as opposed to you sort of guiding them through. So it's just like taking out those unnecessary speed bumps for the audience. Chronologically is when you take the audience through a historical narrative based on the timeline. Obviously, there are relevant examples in movies and books where they start with the ending and then they sort of do like this big flashback for the rest of the book. So it just depends on what point you're trying to make. Topics, topical, you just explain different ideas empirically. I want to get to comparative advantage, right? This is different than problem and solution. So what problem and solution does is you say, here's a problem, and this is my solution, right? And this is important. Here's a problem, this is my solution. What comparative advantage does, I prefer this to problem and solution for this reason, right? With comparative advantage, you say, here's the problem that we're trying to solve. Here's my opponent's solution, and now here is my solution. And what this accomplishes is two things. Number one, when you tell the audience, here's the problem and here's my opponent's solution, you're letting the audience know that you understand the totality of the issue at hand, right? You're not just cherry picking things from things that you already agree with. You're letting the audience know, I'm an expert because I've done all the research, and after I've done all the research, I actually understand the problem, and so I'm going to give you the best solution possible, right? So if you can tell the audience that I understand both sides of the issue, you feel it seems as if you're more of an expert on the topic, right? The second thing it does is it actually undercuts your opponent. So imagine if you're in a debate situation with someone and say, this is the problem. This is what my opponent is going to say. And now this is my response to what my opponent is going to say and what I think is actually a better solution. Now when it's your opponent's turn to go, when your opponent starts talking, what ends up happening is the entire time the audience is thinking in their head, the opponent is giving arguments, but Josh already undercut those arguments with his initial talk, right? So it gives you more credibility because you seem like more of an expert on the entire idea as opposed to only knowing your side of the issue. And it also undercuts your opponent because every time your opponent starts talking, I've already laid out the reason why my opponent's solution is incomplete or inaccurate, or I have a better solution. I will have down in the YouTube comments below, I have an example of this that I use in a lot of my classes from the Eminem movie 8 Mile. It's the final scene where he sort of uses comparative advantage against his opponent. And actually I have another YouTube video on that as well, and I'll include my YouTube discussion. It's like a 5-minute quick video on that scene. Long story short, Eminem gets to go first in this rap battle, and what he does in the first verse of his lyrics is say, these are all the things my opponent's going to say are bad about me, right? It's like, you know, I'm white, I'm trailer trash, you know, my mom is a horrible person, you all had sex with my girlfriend, and, you know, my friends are a bunch of losers. You're going to say that about me? And then Eminem's like, but this is who I really am. When it comes to his opponent's turn to join in the rap battle, his opponent can't say anything because Eminem already sort of put it all out there, right? So the guy who is his opponent would seem sort of redundant if he just sort of throws out the same arguments that the audience has already heard. So I'll put both of those links down below if you want to check it out. With regard to some more stuff on analyzing form, whoever controls the shape of the discussion controls the consequences as well. This is also from your textbook. So you can think about things with regard to the classroom. So who's allowed to speak in the classroom, and how do we control speech in the classroom? For as much pedagogical theory that there is out there about sort of egalitarian classrooms, let's all sit in a circle, or all equals, the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, the professor's the one sort of assigning grades. The professor's the one facilitating discussions, creating syllabus, creating reading lists, controlling topics of discussion, controlling how discussions are created, right? So as much as I might want to sort of flatten out the classroom and make sure everyone's involved in the conversation, I also recognize that, you know, at the end of the day, like, I'm the one grading papers and evaluating students' performance. So this does say some things about power, but it also says some things about power outside the classroom with regard to, you know, news media and who has movies that they write that are greenlit by Hollywood, who has books that are written that are sort of greenlighted by like major publishing companies, right? So as much as we want sort of like free and open, you know, access to ideas and speech, we also recognize that there are these gatekeepers involved, and the gatekeepers allow certain sort of ideas to get through and other ideas not to get through. Sometimes it might be made for sort of malicious or even political reasons. You know, I don't want those ideas out. But sometimes it's simply made for economic reasons, connection reason, network reasons, right? There's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much money that a movie studio can invest in certain films, so they have to make choices. So we always want to pay attention with regard to who is controlling the discussion, because they're the ones who are going to eventually control the consequences of which stories sort of make it out to a larger mass audience. When it comes to our stories start to fall into genres, which you've heard of. Genres, think of it as comes out of the same word as generic, right? You're like, okay, this is making a lot of connections now. Students sort of have an aha moment when they hear this. But generic just means sort of like it fits within a brand, right? It fits within something we already know. We call that a genre. What happens is patterns develop, and this happens everything from political speeches to horror films. So if I'm a politician and I get up on stage to give a stump speech, I'm going to say things like, you know, freedom and justice and equality and a better future for our children and better schools and higher take-home pay, and let's end all the wars and let's bring about peace, and, you know, tomorrow is going to be better than, you know, today. That's a speech that can be given by any politician, right? Left, right, or center, right? Every politician is given that type of speech. So what politicians aren't really arguing about, they're not arguing about sort of like where they want America to get. What politicians are arguing about are like the policies that are actually going to get us to that place. So politicians use these sort of catch-all phrases all the time, no matter what side of the political aisle they're on. But they use those terms because they realize, like, this is a generic form of speech. A political speech is a pattern, right? It is a genre. When politicians give speeches at conventions, they do a lot of like my fellow American type of stuff. And when Obama gave that speech, I believe in 2004 DNC convention, before anybody knew who Senator Obama was at that point, he gave that whole "we're not red America or blue America, we're the United States of America" kind of stuff. Politicians do this. All politicians have a party, but when they sort of get up to a crowd, they do this sort of like all of us. This is what all Americans want. We're all Americans. They don't do necessarily the party politic kind of stuff. All right. The same thing is true again from politics to horror films. So here's a YouTube clip. It's like a 10-minute clip. I'm going to put that down in the YouTube description, where somebody leads you through all of the cliches of a horror film. And the reason that these patterns develop within horror films is because they work. All right, they work over and over and over again. Every once in a while, you're going to get a horror film or some sort of movie that sort of breaks the mold, and it's going to become extremely interesting and get a lot of credit and kudos. But it's very difficult to do because the audience has some sort of expectation for where, in this case, horror films are supposed to go. All right, so when we find patterns that work, we start to mimic them, right? And so you have to think about, who do you mimic, right? Everything from your clothing, to the music you listen to, the movies that you watch, to the words that you use. We're all picking up patterns from friends and from media and from family members with regard to how to go about our lives, because none of us are trying to sort of reinvent the wheel, right? So we all fall into patterns. Genres create stability for us. So we like people who are predictable, right? So if I ask you how you're doing and you say I'm fine, today's a nice day. I like that sort of predictable back and forth with our conversation. At the same time, I want to be predictable for other people, because on some level, I know that if I'm a predictable person, people will want to hang out with me and sort of have me within a community and all this other kind of stuff, right? So genres create stability. So we follow patterns to show people like we're following the rules, we can be a part of the society. And at the same time, we like people who sort of fall into patterns and follow rules, because we're like, okay, you can kind of join our, community here. Stereotypes also are in play here. Stereotypes, they save us time because we can't deal with every detail about everything, right? Obviously, this becomes a problem when we start stereotyping people and then acting on it. But we just sort of talk about like those initial little stereotypes when we're walking through the world and we start sort of hearing noises or seeing things, animals, places, like reading books, watching movies. We start to make a lot of assumptions about those things because we only know a limited amount of information. Now, stereotypes, I know it has a negative connotation, but the thing about stereotypes is that we stereotype because sometimes they work, right? Sometimes stereotypes are true, right? They're not always true, but when they are true, this is what we call confirmation bias, right? And this comes out of psychology. So people say, like, why do you keep stereotyping? Why do you keep stereotyping? The reason is, well, like, because I notice those times when my stereotypes are true and they just sort of confirm the bias that I already have. Now, what's interesting about this is that I don't notice when stereotypes aren't true. So an example of this might be dealing with a mechanic, and let's say that I have a stereotype with regard to women not being able to work on cars. Let's say that that's my stereotype. Well, I might go to a mechanic and I just say, oil and filter change, and I don't really see who's doing the oil and filter change. And let's say for years, it's always been a woman. Well, I don't notice that because nothing has been a hiccup in my life, right? I don't notice it because it's just sort of like, yeah, I take my car into a mechanic, it gets fixed, I go on my day. I don't think about my day when everything goes smoothly, right? We recognize things in our days when things go badly. So now let's say that, the sixth year I take my car into this mechanic, a woman mechanic works on it, and then something happens and my car doesn't work well, and I come back and I say, who worked on it? And they show me, and it's like, oh, a woman mechanic worked on it. It confirms the prejudice and the bias that I already had with regard to my stereotype on women being able to work on cars. All right, so it confirms the bias I had, right? And this is what a lot of us do. We never notice all of the just sort of normal, regular, non-confrontational, non-concerning things that happen throughout our day, every day, right? The world works pretty well for us, all of us, like most days. But that one time when something happens that confirms a stereotype or a prejudice that we already have, we sort of fall into confirmation bias and say, well, look, I told you, women should never work on cars, or whatever your bias might be. All right. So you just have to be careful and recognize that when you do see confirmation bias, it's like it's a one-off event, right? And you also have to recognize, why am I stereotyping that one person when I recognize that other people who would fall into that demographic of people have been completely fine with fixing my car, for years and years on years, and I didn't even think about it, right? So don't just sort of look at some one-off event and say that confirms everything I believed. It's like, well, it confirms one person one time, but there's been hundreds of times you've interacted with people in this regard of a certain demographic where, everything was perfectly normal and they didn't confirm your bias. So you want to make sure you're looking out for confirmation bias when it comes to any sort of prejudicial ideas that you might be holding on to. Genres expose cultural tastes. So this is a chicken and the egg problem. So when it comes to making movies, do we make movies and then we do a few people make movies and then it shapes culture, or is the audience demanding that certain movies be made, so people are making movies that the audience want, right? So this is the sort of like the long-standing debate on like there's too much sex on TV kind of stuff. It's like, is there too much sex on TV because the people who are creating the TV shows are creating sex on TV, and then the audience just has to take it? Or is the audience demanding it, and therefore the creators are sort of putting more sex on television, right? So it's a chicken and the egg problem. They just sort of feed off of one another. Obviously, if you're making a TV show and there's risque material on it and it gets huge ratings, like they're going to keep making it, right? If you make a TV show and it has risque material and nobody watches it because they're offended by it, the TV producers are like, fine, we're going to put on like more family friendly stuff. At the end of the day, like my opinion on the whole matter is that people who make TV shows or who are footing the bill to make TV shows, like they care about making money. So if they could put Barney and Friends in prime time and it would make millions of dollars, like they would do that. I don't think that the heads of these big giant media companies are really concerned what they put on during prime time, only that it makes money. And so it is this sort of audience demand kind of situation. You can kind of keep looking at this, right? Patterns give unity to the ideas in the text. One thing that I'm really interested in, so I was born in the mid 80s, so I kind of grew up, late 80s, early 90s. And I just kind of remember like going to the movies to see different comedies with my parents and family. So what I think is really interesting today compared to when I was coming up in the late 80s through the mid 90s, is that, you have all these like PG, maybe PG-13, maybe with something, I don't know, Tommy Boy might even be PG. It might be PG-13, but I don't really know what's awful in it. But these are like family-friendly comedies that the whole family can watch and the whole family enjoys. And I just can't think of any comedies that have come out in the last 10, 15, maybe 20, maybe 10, 15 years that like I'd be comfortable taking my parents to and not embarrassed about. We go over to this sort of more like Seth Rogen, Judge Apatow kind of stuff, with like Sausage Party and Superbad. And while they're funny, it's like my parents aren't going to take me to that when I'm 10 years old, right? And so genre exposes cultural taste, and so I start to wonder like what happened to all of these sort of family-friendly comedies. Right now, it's like you either have these like G-rated kind of fun movies for kids and parents go and they just kind of suffer through it. It's like, okay, I'll watch this like cartoon. Or you have this other extreme where it's like, all right, super risque, like you're not going to take the whole family to some R-rated film. That's funny, but still like, little kids shouldn't be watching it. So I do wonder sort of like where is that, what sort of happened to these 90 comedy movies, and what does that say about our cultural taste where we have this huge divide now between kid films and adult films with regard to comedy, and there's no more sort of like the whole family can be involved in the film type of situation. Yeah, I mean, I struggle to. I'm sure that some students in the past have given me one or two examples, but it is difficult to find them. At least they're not as prominent as they used to be. With regard to genres, this is some of my fun stuff now. This is what I really enjoy digging into as far as my personal research. I'm really interested with regard to these sort of like long-term genres. So why is it that we keep going back to the same stories, which I'll get on more into the next slide when we talk about archetypes. But one of the genres we can think about in film is what are known as the buddy cop movies. Now we're going to start way over here in the upper left because this is Don Quixote. All right, so this is written by an individual named Cervantes out of Spain many hundreds of years ago. He was writing about the same time as Shakespeare, as a contemporary Shakespeare. He wrote this book called Don Quixote, which is sort of seen as like the first sort of like modern day novel. Very, very influential. But as people have sort of analyzed and looked over the years, for those who don't know, Don Quixote is this individual who reads a lot of books about chivalry, and he sort of wants to be a knight, but he's not a knight, and so he sort of has to make up stories for himself to kind of go out and fight the bad guys. But he kind of keeps running across people who aren't bad guys, but he just sort of makes them bad guys in his mind so he can have this sense of, being a knight, all right? And, saving the princess and all this other kind of stuff, right? He just makes this up in his head. He comes across his sidekick, if you will, right? So we have this sort of like Batman and Robin situation. Sancho. So he comes across Sancho, and Sancho is a little bit more of a voice of reason. So Don Quixote comes across, and he's like, look, there's these giants, and Sancho's like, those are windmills. Those aren't giants. Like, there's no reason to go and fight a windmill. So you have this sort of individual who's a bit of a comic relief character, and you have the person who's a little bit more voice of reason. You have the person who's more erratic, and the person who's a little bit more dispassionate and sober-minded. But people have talked about Don Quixote, and they're like, this is sort of like the first buddy cop movie that we're super into. Now, I only have 6 showing up here on the screen, but, I mean, you just, Google image search like buddy cop movies, and you will find list and list and list, right? This list goes on forever. So it becomes very interesting to me, right? This isn't a good thing, bad thing. What's interesting to me is, why do we keep doing the same thing? Like, why do we keep telling the same story? Like, there's so many other relationships and stories and professions that we could be making movies about, but we do kind of keep falling in this interesting pattern where it's like 2 cops. One's, pretty sober-minded, right? And the other one's a bit erratic or comedy-prone. But we keep making movies about it. So if we kind of go back into the 80s, maybe the 70s, I don't know, I wasn't around for Miami Vice, but we have something like Miami Vice. I do know that they made a movie of it. I think it's Jamie Foxx and Colin Farrell. I might have that wrong. I think it's that movie. But they sort of updated, right, this movie from the 80s. You have this movie down here, The Other Guy. So even though it's a comedy with Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg, it's still similar, right? Lethal Weapon, right? Danny Glover's a sort of like sober-minded, like, cop, does it by the books, and, Mel Gibson's this erratic, whatever. Rush Hour, you have Bad Boys, and then this movie, The Heat, that came out a couple years ago, which I think I ended up seeing like 2 or 3 times because it was fantastic, with Melissa McCarthy and Sandra Bullock. All right, so Sandra Bullock is sort of like the sober-minded FBI, play it by the books her whole life, and Melissa McCarthy's like, no, like, vigilantism, like, we don't need to play by the rules, like, let's go out there and get these bad guys. So this is just interesting, right? We can still make buddy cop movies, but again, it's like we found a pattern that works. It's connected back to some of the stuff that Cervantes was doing with Don Quixote. And we still kind of follow this pattern of like, let's have 2 people who are committed to law and order, but one is a little bit, one is like very much by the books, and the other one is, erratic, like kind of like we got to get away from the books. The bureaucracy is just keeping us down, and we're never going to get these bad guys. They're going to get off the hook if like we don't take charge of the legal system, kind of stuff. So that's interesting to me, right? It's a genre, it's a pattern that, for one way or another, like cultural taste has gravitated to it. People enjoy it, and we keep pumping out these movies on and on and on. And I'm sure within the next year or 2, once they start making more movies after COVID, there's going to be more buddy cop movies. Another idea here with regard to archetypes and genres, this gets into some stories that have been around a lot longer than just the buddy cop stuff. We keep telling like similar stories. This genre I'm talking about now is known as the hero's journey, which you might have seen. What's interesting to me about the hero's journey, it's found throughout lots of different cultures, and again, it's been going on for thousands of years, and we keep using it, even to the point of just a couple summers ago, with the Black Panther movie. So what the hero's journey is, or how, not all these stories are exactly the same, but they have very, very similar themes in common. So you have this sort of, you have some sort of king or prince or some sort of noble type of individual. In the case of Hercules, as well as Jesus, right? You have these sort of figures who are ordained by God, right? And then they have some sort of fall moment where they become more common, right? They have to go through struggles, and then they sort of like rise back up to their place on top of the throne, right? Wherever it is. So this story also happens in a lot of different cultures. Here we have the Buddha, who before he was Buddha was Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince. He was like, I want to get out of the castle. I want to get out of the kingdom. I want to get out from behind these walls. I want to go out and see sort of like, how do regular people live? He went out. Siddhartha Gautama goes out. He sees all this pain and suffering in the world, and he's like, how do I help all these other people? Why is there so much pain and suffering? How can we like limit it? How can we decrease it? He starts, meditating and thinking about it, and he goes through all these these journeys, right? With his body and with his meditation and with his eating and sleeping. He does all this stuff, right? Eventually becomes enlightened. Then he's the Buddha, right? This is a similar story, right? We kind of see this a little bit over in Aladdin. Here's the cartoon Aladdin with Princess Jasmine. She's behind the palace wall. She's like, I don't want to be behind the palace walls. I want to go in the market. I want to see all these people. And she goes out into the market, right? So she's like, I want to get out of these palace walls. I want to go see what the rest of the world has to offer me. Some other, so this is a depiction of Gilgamesh, which is sort of the oldest known manuscript that we have from Mesopotamia. Similar type of thing, with royalty wanting to go out on a journey. There's a lot of temptation there, and eventually he has to kind of circle back to sort of, he has to go through the fire of temptation and struggle in order to kind of circle all the way back to, now I can be this sort of like kingly ruler, sort of knowing what the rest of the world is about, right? So a lot of these people are sort of like born into royalty, if you will, but because they haven't struggled, they don't really appreciate it, and they kind of come back around. Similar things down here. If you so this is the Lion King and Black Panther. It's the same movie. There's a lot written on how these are the same movie. You have a prince, dad dies, he gets super sad about it. They both leave. They go and say, I'm not going to be the king anymore. And then their family comes and finds them, like, you got to come back because, Black Panther's cousin comes in, the Lion King, his uncle comes in. They're managing the kingdom terribly. So they come back and they fight for their kingdom. And then it's like, okay, now I have earned the right to be the king, right? Because I've sort of gone through all these struggles. Over here we have Hercules and we have Jesus, right? So Hercules, son of Zeus. I guess technically Hercules is the son of Jupiter. Heracles is the son of Zeus. It's the same person. They just have different names because the Romans stole all the Greek gods when they have kind of took over the world around the in the early part of the zeros to 100s. All right. So Hercules has what's called like the choice of Hercules. So he's born of a god and a mortal woman. Jesus obviously, is conceived. God goes to Mary, conceived of a virgin, right? So you have this mortal woman, Mary, right? Hercules has this choice where he can choose between vice and virtue. And vice is you can have all the food and the kingdom and the women, and you can just kind of live fat and happy and watch Netflix all day. Or you can sort of struggle through life doing these 12 labors. It's like go, fight the Hydra, go kill this impenetrable lion, go steal these apples, go kill all these horses that are eating people. And they give Hercules that choice, and instead of saying like, I want to stay in the kingdom, like I'm the son of Zeus, for crying out loud, I can do whatever I want. Hercules says, no, like I want to go through these trials because I want to like see what the rest of the world is like. There's going to be meaning in that struggle, right? In order to sort of become king as opposed to just being given the kingdom. Hercules wants to sort of fight for it and see what he's actually made of, right? A lot of young men are doing this today too, right? They want to put themselves through a trial. People don't want to be handed stuff. People are handed stuff, but all of these stories are telling us that people will rebel. People enjoy kind of being stripped down to bare bones and sort of fighting and clawing and making it on their own. There's meaning in that. Finally, I do have our friend Pinocchio here, who's not royal, but there is this similar archetypal story with Pinocchio. And as far as, Pinocchio, there's a good connection to Gilgamesh here with regard to temptation. So Pinocchio ends up on this island with all these boys, and there's a lot of smoking and a lot of drinking and playing pool and gambling. And so he's fallen into temptation. He finds out, Geppetto's looking for him, his father's looking for him. And so Pinocchio has to kind of get out of his temptations, get out of this horrible lifestyle that he's living, right? And go and sort of rescue his father. His father's been swallowed by this whale, which also, obviously connected back to Jonah and the great fish. So there's all these interesting stories where it's like, I got to go back and I have to sort of like avenge my father or stand in for my father or rescue my father, obviously with Simba and Mufasa. In the Black Panther film, which I'm not as familiar with, but I don't remember the king's name. So they're going back to sort of like fill their father's shoes, like get back into sort of get back into fill their father's shoes. And Pinocchio's doing the same thing. Fall into temptation, you go through that adolescent phase, but eventually it's like you got to put on your big boy pants, you got to become a man, and you have to go through the trials on your own, and so to show everybody that you've earned the right to be an adult, earned the right to, in these cases, be royalty, be a king. This is your destiny to fulfill. All right. So this sort of hero's journey with all these individuals who were destined to be royalty, and they wanted to go through the trials and tribulations in order to earn that place. All right, couple quick things here on Brave New World in 1984. This is shifting to actually the next day of class, but I just want to go ahead and put it all in the same video, so it's here for you. With regard to analyzing form, one thing that's interesting with this regard is we're going to look at Brave New World versus 1984 and how they are both trying to get across similar messages, but they're doing it in a different way. All right. So up here, you have Aldous Huxley, and down here you have George Orwell. And what both of them are doing is they're telling stories about dystopian futures with all-powerful and tyrannical governments. All right? But they're making different predictions via the form of the text that lead to fun contemporary philosophical debates. All right? We're going to run through both of these. I've also included here the Hunger Games, which is derived from this sort of dystopian stories. As well as Ayn Rand's Anthem, which is a short novella that is also this sort of dystopian idea of it's very Hunger Games similar. Well, I guess Hunger Games is similar to it since Anthem was written first, but it's sort of in the same genre of what happens when this sort of like all-powerful government continues to be tyrannical and putting pressure on individuals to kind of stay in their place. All right. You're not allowed to be an individual. You're not allowed to sort of go out and make your own path in the world. The government just says, like, we'll take care of you. Just sort of stay in the Hunger Games. It's like stay in your district. We'll send food every now and again, but just stay in your district, right? Don't get off the path. With George Orwell, it's like, we'll take care of you. Just like do your job. Like stay with your group of people. Just do your job. Don't worry about other people's jobs. Just keep doing your own job. All right. So all these stories are trying to sort of tell like what happens in a dystopian future where, there's a central, there's this sort of like central hub of government where nobody outside of this small group of individuals has any say on what happens. So with 1984, it's written in 1948. Winston Smith is a citizen of Oceania. The theme is, Big Brother is watching you. There's these thought police. There's Newspeak, which is a way in which the government keeps scaling back the dictionary, so they keep eliminating words that you're not allowed to say, because if I have access to words, then I have access to arguing against government tyranny. But if they say you can't use those words, then all of a sudden it's harder for me to be clear and precise in my speech. So This gets off into another tangent on censorship, which I am not a fan of if you've ever, been in any of my classes. And the reason is because I need all the words that I can get because I need to be precise. I need to be precise in my speech. And if you start taking words out of my vocabulary, I have to start using other words that might not be exact with regard to what I need in order to be articulate on what my thoughts are. So speech is an inarticulate way to get your thoughts out, right? Speech is imprecise, it's clunky, right? So you need more and more and more vocabulary in order to be as precise as possible with the thoughts that are in your head. Let's get here real quick with regard to the memory hole. What Winston does is he works for, he sits around all day and he takes old newspapers and he goes through old newspapers and he edits them to remove all of the words that are no longer allowed, and then he takes all the old newspapers and he puts them down what's called the memory hole, which is basically a big chute that goes to a furnace and it burns up all the old news and the old books that have words and ideas in it that are no longer allowed anymore, right? So literally every day in 1984 is like a new day because they kind of keep going back and editing and changing the past a little bit based on what words and vocabulary and ideas are no longer allowed. Now, this is the sort of overall theme of 1984, all right? Power is in the hands of the oligarchs, right? This sort of tyrannical, centralized big brother government, right? But the main characters are actively rebelling, right? So Winston meets this girl that he really likes. She kind of gets him on board with like, let's be rebels, and he likes it. He takes to it, right? So 1984 is more similar to Hunger Games, where it's the government is tyrannical and people are rebelling against the government. All right, people are actively trying to rebel against the government. So that's one view of what might happen when the government gets too tyrannical. This is not what Huxley. So Huxley writes this book called Brave New World, which is a similar theme, right? Tyrannical government, right? It's written in 1931, so before 1984. But he writes this world of like test tube babies who are genetically modified for superiority. Babies are conditioned to hate flowers, right, and other non-productive things, so including books, right? So different ideas. So there's this awful scene where like babies are crawling around on this floor, and if they go towards like a flower or a book, they get a little zap on them, right? So it's very much it's a world of sort of like constant material productivity. Like you don't engage with like beauty for the sake of beauty. You don't engage with art for the sake of art. It's like if you're not doing productive things to further the cause of the government as far as like, constant economic growth, what have you, it's like you're going to get shocked. All right. The difference here, real quick, with sleep learning, people keep people happy and peaceful at all times so they won't rebel. You could think about this as like Netflix. It's like you get done watching Netflix and they just like put on the next show for you. And so you just kind of keep going. And before you know it, it's like 8 o'clock at night and you're like, what did I do all day? All right. Now, here's the difference between Brave New World 1984, right? The power is still in the hands of the oligarchs. It's still in the hands of a few people at the top of the government, right? But the people are happy and they're not rebelling, right? So this is what Brave New World is compared to 1984. So this is the big sort of interesting philosophical argument that happens in sort of academia, right? So each book writes the same argument for what a dystopian future will look like, but they have different conclusions with regard to how the masses will interact with that new reality, right? Huxley predicts that the masses are just going to kind of go along with it, right? You can think about the movie WALL-E if you've seen WALL-E. It's like we're going to sit in our chairs. We're literally going to have a TV, right? This is watching Netflix all day, and we're going to be drinking, Slurpees from 7-Eleven, right? We're just going to kind of sit around and just have, I mean, gosh, now that I'm thinking about it, you can think about WALL-E, not only with like sitting in a chair watching Netflix, but it's like Amazon's just like bringing everything you need to your doorstep, right? That's WALL-E. It's like everything just comes to your chair. You never have to leave. You just kind of sit around and go through life. And that's what Huxley predicts. Huxley predicts like the majority of people aren't going to rebel at all, right? 1984, right, the main character, Winston, he is actively rebelling the whole time. Same thing in the Hunger Games, right? Katniss is like, she is actively rebelling, and everybody sort of in her town, while they're not all of them are, picking up arms, all of them are like talking about like rebelling, like they are actively making plans. All right. That's what 1984 predicts. 1984 says we're going to rebel. Brave New World says, no, you're not. You're going to sit around and watch Netflix and have Amazon deliver you stuff. And as long as you are kept sort of like, fat and happy, like you're not going to worry about it. Right. So this is an interesting debate to have, right? How would you react if people try to sort of like condition more and more and more your life? So we have the last slide here, right? So the big question that I like to do in my classrooms with my students, I break them into groups and I say, okay, you all have to argue now, like, are we living in 1984 or are we living in Brave New World? Are we living in a world where fewer and fewer people have control and we're all just kind of taking it, right? Or are we living in a world where fewer and fewer people have control and people are actively rebelling to try to sort of create a life for themselves as opposed to just having people create the life for them, right? So you have a couple questions you have to ask yourself, like, would you really rebel, right? If people were, if you felt that people were actively trying to control your life, or if you felt that if we get away from the government stuff, but if you feel like Facebook has too much of your information, Twitter's like mining too much of your information, Google has all your information, Netflix, Amazon, like, would you really rebel to the point of like, I want some of my privacy back, right? You have to ask yourself, like, am I rebelling right now? Are there ways in which I am curbing my social media use, or I don't give out all my private information to every large, tech company that wants it? And if you do, like, and most of us are going to say, like, no, I would totally rebel. Well, then what you need to do, right, is show me evidence where you have stood up against the status quo at the risk of losing everything. And the truth is, most of us haven't, and most of us probably wouldn't, right? When there's a status quo, as most people, right, feel like as long as I'm doing okay in the status quo, there's no reason for me to rebel because I could literally lose everything. And it's like, as long as I'm pretty comfortable, I don't really know if I'm going to speak up. This doesn't, this feeds a lot into stuff like, not only our jobs, but our politics, our social life, cultural, whatever. Yeah, you have to sort of weigh these pros and cons of would I actually stand up at the risk of losing everything if I saw something bad that was going on. Huxley said we're not going to, right? He's like, most people are just going to be happy. They're going to enjoy living their life as this sort of in this test tube baby world. And yeah, as long as you're taken care of, like in Wall-E, you're probably not going to rebel. 1984 says, people would rebel. All right. What do you see happening with people today that makes you think that we're going to either live in 1984 or Brave New World? Here's a book by Neil Postman, came out, I think 30 years ago now. This says 20th anniversary, but I think this picture is a little bit older. I think it's 30 years now. But he makes the argument in this book, and 30 years ago, it's like now you kind of ramp that up a lot with the advent of like, Facebook and social media and the internet with regard to like Netflix and stuff. He makes the argument that we're living in a Brave New World, right? Amusing ourselves to death. His whole thing is like show business just keeps feeding us more and more movies and TV series where we just sit around all day and it's like, I can't keep up enough. I have to keep consuming what it is that they're feeding me. So Neil Postman says we're amusing ourselves to death. Like we are just so engaged with constantly consuming entertainment that we're not actually going out there and living a productive life for ourselves. Like, what is it that we're creating? What is it that we're making? Like people can keep giving us like pre-made food, but it's like, are you learning how to cook? People can keep giving us like constant stories, but it's like, are you creating stories? Are you creating, books and literature and movies? And, how are you engaging with people? You might think it's like, I got some Twitter followers and some Facebook friends, but it's like, are you actually actively engaged with, gravitating and taking care of your family members, right? You might have a Facebook friend 1,000 miles away you've never met, but it's like, are you having these same conversations with the people who are living in your house with you, right? So that's his big question here. And he thinks that, Postman, obviously by the title, he thinks that we're just sort of amusing ourselves to death. We're amusing ourselves in a way where eventually we're going to look back and be like, did I actually live a life, or did I just consume these sort of like larger things that were just created for me to, again, sort of keep me docile, right? Keep me in that chair, drinking those big gulps, right? Like a character from the movie Wall-E. And finally, there's a YouTube clip here. This is from Jim Gaffigan. I will post this YouTube clip down in the YouTube comments. But Jim Gaffigan is sort of making a joke about Netflix and binge watching, where he's sort of making the same point, right? Where he says, look, we're all, we all think that we're that we're all doing this on our own, but then we that we would sort of rise up and rebel. But he's like, what do we actually do? We sit around and we watch Netflix, and then we get caught up in Netflix, and then all of a sudden, I think there's some line in here where he's like, what? He's like, my wife had a baby, right? And that baby's 5 years old now. What happened to all that time, right? And it's because he's sitting around watching Netflix all day. So these are things that we want to be aware of. Obviously, these are some sad pictures. I mean, this is a stock photo here of just like an entire family. Looks like 4 boys. But it's like, or even if they're friends, right? Siblings, whatever. It's like maybe they should go out and play, baseball together or kickball together, or God, just like wrestle each other around the house. I'm sure their parents would probably be happier with them like breaking a light than sitting around on a couch all day, each on their own tablet. And this is an actual product here that you can buy, where you can put around your neck to hold your tablet for you so you can watch movies, right? I think I actually saw one person with a similar type of device like this in an airport once. And they sort of use it on, using it and waiting for the plane. And then they got on the plane, and, they were sitting on the plane the whole time watching it like this. And you're like, oh, that's kind of convenient, right? Because, we need to prop up our stuff to watch it 5 feet or a foot from our face. But, you're missing eye contact with a lot of people around you, okay? So, all right, that's the big thing on analyzing form. It was 2 different days, right, as far as just like understanding what genres are. Understand that the stories that we're telling today are stories that have been told for, if not hundreds of years, thousands of years, right? Some of these stories go all the way back to Gilgamesh. Some of the buddy cop stuff, right, that just goes back to, Cervantes. But then also just sort of recognizing that these movies that kind of keep coming out, right, these buddy cop movies, it's like they're predictable, and you have to have this chicken and the egg question of like, do they keep making them because we consume them? Are we demanding them, right? They're responding to consumer demands. And my big thing is like, whether or not they're responding to consumer demands, I'm just interested of like, what is it about the human brain and what it is that we enjoy seeing in the stories we like, to consume. Why is it that we like consuming those stories, right? There's a infinite amount of stories that we could tell as far as like the relationships involved and the genres and the professions. It's like we could tell whatever story we want, but we keep telling these stories. And so that's what I'm extremely interested in as someone who, I consider myself a rhetorician, as someone who studies narratives. I'm not, I'm least concerned about, whether or not we should or shouldn't tell these stories. I'm just interested is like, why do we, like, as humans, why is it that we are so enthralled by these types of stories, right? Why are we so enthralled with the hero's journey, with stories that involve like kingdoms? It's like it's not like there's like these active kingdoms still around in the year 2020. It's like we still got a queen over in England, but it's like they also have parliament and they vote for things, right? But we're still telling these stories of like Black Panther comes out and we're like, there's an easier way to solve this Black Panther problem. It's like, how about all the people of Wakanda just have a vote, right? And it's like, who do you want? Do you want the Black Panther or do you want his cousin to be in charge? But that'd be a pretty quick movie. But it's like, no, it's like we like the kingdom thing. We like 2 people fighting for the throne. When really you could just say like, oh, let's just have an election and then we don't have to worry about it. But that'd be a short movie, all right? So this is what I become interested in with regard to analyzing form, analyzing arguments, how genres are created, and recognizing that just you need to recognize that you consume these narratives, and how are you mimicking them? How are you perpetuating them? What patterns do you see in your own life? And then finally, this stuff with 1984 and Brave New World. As much as all of us, especially, probably me, because I'm very, very stubborn, so I definitely include myself in this. We all want to see ourselves as strong individuals who aren't going to take any crap from anybody, and I create my own life. The thing is that all of us fall into these these behaviors of Brave New World, where we just say, yeah, but okay, Amazon, you can have all my information because it's really nice to get all of my groceries delivered to my house in 2 hours or whatever it is. Okay, Netflix, you can have all my information, and like let's just keep watching TV because that's easier than picking up a book, or let's just kind of keep living a life where we're just going to give Google all of our information because it's easier for them to through an algorithm to tell me what I probably like, as opposed to me actually going out there and sort of discovering my own life. All right, so just be aware of these things. And now that you're aware of these things, now you get to go out and make a decision sort of how you're going to move forward with regard to your relationship with these sort of more powerful cultural narratives that are constantly shaping us, right? So be aware of it, make a decision, but as long as you're aware of it, we're in a good spot, all right? That's our discussion on chapter 6. This covers 2 days of material. I got us out of here under 50 minutes, so I feel pretty good about that. I will see you all next time.